This is the theme to the podcast. It's inspired by an old TV theme. One of the best I'd ever seen. So here it is, the theme to the podcast. What does Chris think?
About dreams, be they prophetic glimpses, aspirations of life, or nightmares filled with strife. Whether you remember them in the morning or claim they never happened, we all dream. We all spend about a third of our lives entirely detached from reality, staring at the inside of our own eyelids, where our brain runs a nightly film festival where we are the writer, the director, the audience, and sometimes the confused extra who forgot their pants. It's a bizarre piece of the human design. We take it for granted because it happens every single night. But when you actually sit down and look at the sheer mechanics of what our minds do while our body rests, it's nothing short of incredible. I recently came across a study from a few years ago by David Eagleman, a neuroscientist who has a remarkably grounded way at looking at the complex machinery of the human brain. Eagleman doesn't just treat the brain as a static computer. He views it as a dynamic, deeply competitive piece of territory, where each sense is constantly fighting for real estate. His specific research into dreaming leads to what he calls the defensive activation theory. It turns out that the brain is incredibly greedy. In the visual cortex, the neurons responsible for processing vision are highly adaptable, but that adaptability comes with a massive downside. If left in the dark for too long, the neighboring senses, like touch and hearing, will literally creep over the border and conquer that territory. It's the ultimate evolutionary game of King of the Hill. Now, think about what happens when the sun goes down and we close our eyes to sleep. For thousands of years, darkness meant total visual deprivation. If the visual cortex sat completely silent for 8 hours every single night, the auditory and tactile parts of the brain would slowly dismantle it, rendering us slightly less capable of seeing clearly when we wake up. According to the Eagleman's research, dreams are essentially an internal defense mechanism. Every 90 minutes or so during our REM sleep, a very primitive part of the brain stem shoots anatomical electrical storms straight into the visual cortex. It's a biological placeholder. It is the brain's way of running a screensaver to prevent burn-in, or keeping the engine running on a cold night just so the battery doesn't die. When you look at it through that lens, the strange, chaotic narratives of our dreams aren't necessarily mystical messages. They're the conscious mind trying to make sense of random electrical data being fired into the back of our eyeballs to keep our vision intact. It's a beautifully practical explanation for why seeing things there when there's nothing there to look at. That said, knowing the mechanics of the system doesn't completely strip away the magic of what happens once the show starts. Which brings us to the people who don't just watch the movie, but decide to grab the steering wheel, or the director's chair, and become lucid dreamers. The transition from being a passive observer in your own mind and realizing you actually are in charge is where things get truly fascinating. The realm of lucid dreaming isn't just internet lore or something cooked up by Christopher Nolan in screenplays. It has been rigorously studied in laboratories, and it's something I'm able to do. But we'll get more on that later. We got into lucid dreaming. The pioneer of the research was Stephen LaBerge, back in Stanford in the late 70s. Before his work, mainstream science looked at lucid dreaming with a healthy dose of skepticism. The kind of a polite nod you give to the uncle who claims he saw a UFO out behind the woodshed. The problem was of proof. How does someone completely inside a paralyzed state communicate to a researcher sitting in a lab chair that they're awake inside their own head? LaBerge figured out a loophole in our biological design. When we drop into REM, our voluntary muscles go into a state of temporary paralysis, atonia, so we don't accidentally act on our dreams and jump up and dive headfirst off our nightstand. But there's an exception to that rule: our eyes. The muscles that control the movement of our eyes remain completely unbound by that paralysis. LaBerge had his subject memorize specific eye patterns, say 2 clicks to the left, 2 clicks to the right, to perform the moment they realized they were dreaming. Lo and behold, the polygraph machines recorded the distinct intentional sweeps of eyes right in the middle of the deep REM sleep. It was a historic moment. It was the psychological equivalent of a stranded astronaut radioing back from Mars via an antique probe. They proved that the person could maintain a razor-sharp consciousness intellect while their physical body was completely dead to the world. To be fair, anyone who's ever managed to pull this off knows that the moment of realization is incredibly fragile. You catch a weird pattern, maybe a clock that has symbols instead of numbers, or you realize you're driving a car from the back seat, and you think, wait, I'm dreaming. That immediate temptation to start flying or conjure up a Ferrari or to test the limits of the simulation, like a kid who found the developer cheat codes in a video game. But here's the thing. If you get too excited, your heart rate spikes. The neurochemistry shifts and the whole fragile illusion collapses around you, dragging you right back to the cold reality of the waking world. It requires an odd kind of emotional discipline over your own subconsciousness, where you acknowledge the dream without shattering it. Now, if Eagleman explains the hardware and Labarge mapped the software, we're still left with the oldest question in the book. What do the actual stories mean? Why did we dream about an old high school acquaintance trying to sell you a lawnmower in the middle of the desert? Now, this is where the road splits. If you look back at the early days of modern psychoanalysis, the architecture of the dreaming mind was treated like a crime scene where everything was a hidden clue. You can't talk about this era without hitting the massive psychological rift between Sigmund Freud and his once protege, Carl Jung. Freud, bless his brilliant, deeply obsessive heart, looked at the dream as a basement where we lock up all of our unacceptable wishes, repressed desires, and anxieties. To Freud, the dreaming mind was a master of disguise, taking raw, taboo impulses and dressing them up in symbols so that we wouldn't wake up shocked by our own internal nature. It was an incredibly rigid way of thinking. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. But Freud's universe, nothing was ever just as it appeared to be. It was dark, cynical. It was a view of struggle against your own inner beasts and baser instincts. Carl Jung came along and he broke that mold entirely. He didn't see the subconscious as a dumpster for our worst thoughts. He saw it as a deeply wise, ancient partner trying to restore balance to our waking lives. Jung believed that dreams speak in a language of symbols because that's how our human psyche had processed the world long before we invented words and grammar. He introduced the idea of a collective unconsciousness, a shared basement of all human history filled with universal archetypes like the shadow, the wise old man, the anima, and the trickster. Where Freud saw puzzles to be solved, Jung saw conversations to be had. If a person was acting completely arrogant and invulnerable during their waking hours, Jung noticed their dreams would often place them in simulations where they were small, helpless, or exposed. The subconscious wasn't trying to punish them. It's trying to compensate for their ego's blind spots. It was a system trying to keep itself fair and level. Jung famously refused to use cookie-cutter dream dictionaries. He understood that a dog in a dream means one thing to a mailman who gets chased every Tuesday, and something else entirely by a person who grew up with a loyal golden retriever. The context mattered above all else. When you look back at that era of thinking, you realize that these guys were essentially explorers trying to map a continent that they could never see, using only the stories people told them from across a velvet couch. They were trying to bring order to a beautiful, untamed chaos that is the human mind. So, that's a lot of information and very little of what I think. I get it. But the thing is, I can't just jump straight to my thoughts, without knowing that we're both on the same page with the groundwork. So now that we are, the human mind is so vast in capability and capacity, I don't think we'll ever fully understand it. We are too small to comprehend how massive we are. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a lucid dreamer. I can control the dreamscape, which a lot of people think is an awesome concept. And it is, but when you're battling depression in the real world, when you fade off to the dream, guess what you live and relive over and over again. Many people run to sleep to escape the world. Sometimes, though, lucid dreamers just get stuck reliving their darkest moments. So, of course, I drive myself to exhaustion and then just fall asleep and dream. On good days, I could work on my stories, my plots, action sequences, and pacing, all by living through the story. But on my bad days, I pay someone else to listen to those stories right now. When left to my own mind's desires, when I'm not depressed, not having to control the dream, many times they're just colors. Swirls of different colors dancing around, or hard lines of green streaking across, or expanding to take over the entire image. Sometimes during these dreams, I can make some sense of them. Some colors, when they show up, they're almost always tied to certain things. Like, for instance, I am often a red dot or a short red line. And every time I dream yellow, I know exactly who it is. There is my depression there, and when it shows up, it's like a darker hue, not like a shadow, but like a darkening of the hues and colors around it. It's interesting. I've never met anybody else that dreams in colors, and if you're one of them, I would love to hear from you. Finally, I have a third type of dream state. There are times, even as I try to take the director's chair and run my own dreams, they resist, almost as if the dream is greater than me. At times, they feel like my mind is trying to process something, trying to teach me something, trying to show something important that I missed throughout the day. Then others, it's like I'm unable to shake the feeling that I'm dreaming something important or someone else's dream. I know that sounds weird. I'm not going to go so far as to say they're prophetic, but they regularly do seem to point to something that does tangentially transpire. I have, on more than one occasion, had a dream that signaled the end of a relationship before the people involved had ever thought about it. I have, through dreams, felt the coming of dark times, be it a death, an accident, or a life-altering event to my storge. See episode 3 for an explanation on storge. I have found evidence that my dreams are sometimes strangely connected. Now, I'll not at this time detail the full events of my sister, who's had a much better track record at having dreams, understanding them, and seeing the direct outcomes and interpretation of those dreams play out. Maybe someday we can do a follow-up on this episode, and I can get her on here and tell you some of her stories. She has some very interesting and goosebump-inducing stories. Fingers crossed we'll get into what does Chris think about his sister's dreams someday. Now, I'm not going to go a hard line on religion, as I've said before, but after all, this is what I think. And I believe there are forces that we can't fully understand at work in our world. Some call it spiritual warfare, some call it witchcraft. Either way, I think there's something happening out there that we just don't quite understand. But that's a big conversation. I think we'll save that one for another day as well. Anyway, in the end, maybe the truth of dreaming lies somewhere in the middle of all of this. We have a clinical defensive brain keeping its visual wires hot. We have the rare exhilarating moments of consciousness while asleep inside our own machine. And the quiet poetic inner voice trying to untangle the knots of our lives in a world. It's a remarkable piece of human architecture. We leave our phones on the charger, we close our eyes, and without spending a dime, we get to explore the furthest reaches of our own private universe every single night. And honestly, whether it's a defensive biological screensaver or a message from the deep, it's a pretty incredible show to be a part of. So, about dreams, I'm Chris, and this is what I thought.